First on 4, Listening Eye.
They shouldn't always ask social workers. Deaf people are not aware of what being an interpreter really means. Deaf people in Cornwall have relied on social workers for so many years. It's like a tradition, a habit that's hard to get out of, a hard habit to break.
Please. We're up to speed with the machine, so Clark, if you could take your position, please.
Hello and welcome again. Today, as always on Listening Eye, we have a mixed team of deaf and hearing people making the programme. And to help me communicate with the studio floor manager, for example, or the director up in the control room, I need good interpreters. In fact, for today's programme, we have one interpreter here on the studio floor and one upstairs in the control room. And we also have an interpreter to help me interview a hearing person. And later in the programme, I'll be talking to Liz Scott Gibson as a guest, who is herself a well-known interpreter. So, that's 4 registered interpreters here in our studio in Newcastle, just to make one half-hour programme. Now, incredible as it may seem, that represents nearly 4% of the total number of registered interpreters in the UK. There are only 72 registered in the whole of England and Wales, 25 in Scotland, and a mere 4 in Northern Ireland. And if you live in Cornwall, it seems that the 4 interpreters here today represent 4 more than the total number of registered interpreters who live in the whole of the county. So, who can blame deaf people if, as Marilyn Roach said at the beginning of the programme, they're not aware of what being an interpreter really means? Later, I'll be discussing some of Cornwall's problems and what can be done to solve them with Mervyn Davey of Cornwall County Council's Services for the Hearing Impaired. But first, for a consumer's eye view of the situation down there, here's a report by Rachel Bastiker.
This is Cornwall, the most southwesterly part of England. An area of really beautiful coastline, scattered towns and villages, and peaceful countryside. A very nice place to live. But the fact that it is so remote, quiet and sparsely populated can cause problems when it comes to services for deaf people as well as hearing. And for the deaf community, the provision of interpreting services is a particular difficulty. We've come to the small town of Cambourne to ask some deaf people to tell us about their problems.
A while ago, when I first moved to Cornwall, I had a personal problem. To my dismay, when I arrived, I saw the Reverend Parsons, a man. I had to visit the doctor who I didn't know very well, and I didn't want to go along with a man. It was really embarrassing. I didn't want him. I preferred a woman. Eventually, Rev Parsons retired, and I was in a bit of a quandary. Who would help me? So I had to make do with my mother-in-law coming to the doctors with me. They seemed to talk for ages, but then the information she gave me was so brief. I wasn't satisfied. I don't agree with that, but we've no interpreters.
Well, a short while ago, there was an open day in Cornwall's Deaf Centre, and I stood up to give a speech. I was signing away because it was a really important occasion. Now, there were interpreters there, but not qualified, unfortunately. Anyway, there was this one interpreter, and I was giving my speech. There were a lot of hearing people present, and the interpreter was voicing for them. Well, after I finished my speech, someone came up to me and said, "Did you say you had tattoos up your arms?" I said, "No, I didn't say that. What I did say was that I rolled up my sleeves ready to get stuck in." You see, that person had no idea what I was signing. We really must push for higher standards. That's the problem in Cornwall just now.
In the Cornwall area, there are no qualified interpreters. There's nothing. It's a very poor situation. There's a lot of communicators, but there are very few with a high level of communication. It's a very poor area. Social workers are asked to come in a lot. Deaf people request them a lot, but often they're the wrong people. Social workers have to write reports when they get back to the office, and these reports could be seen by other social workers, their records, whereas an interpreter would be better. They just go along, do the job, go home, and that's the end of it, finished.
I told my husband I wanted to see the doctor in private to discuss my problem, and I didn't want to go with a male social worker. We agreed it would be better to go with a woman, an interpreter. So off I went to see the doctor, discussed my problem in private, then came home. Later, a social worker arrived at my door. I asked what he wanted, and he said, "I'd like a word in private." So he came in, and I said, "What do you want?" And the social worker said, "It's about your problem." I was taken aback. "How do you know I have a problem? Who told you?" Apparently, the interpreter must report everything. It's in the rules. I was really shocked to discover that. I didn't know anything about it.
I've seen communicators responding incorrectly, saying what a deaf person has said, and it's wrong. They've got the meaning all wrong, and that's terrible. Some interpreters, no, some social workers, ask me if I can go with them to visit a deaf person, because the communication is such a problem and they don't understand them. Now they ask me to go with them, and I'm quite happy. I'm deaf and can help with communication. I explain what the deaf person means and what they want, then the social worker understands. But it's not right.
Now, to me, the problem really is money. Funding. Where is it? There isn't any. I've applied to Cornwall County Council for money to set something up for interpreters. But they're always saying, "We've no money. No money." We deaf people feel it's like we just don't exist. It's like they really couldn't care less. Well, that's what it seems to me.
I'd like to see the interpreting service improved, given a substantial amount of funding, enough to cover 12 months, and used to send good communicators, those who have the potential to become interpreters, a feeling for the deaf identity, away for interpreter training. Help them to build up their confidence. Also, BSL tutors. We need to have more training. Cornwall always seems to be the last to know what's going on. Sometimes we go away on weekend workshops or to learn something, and we're amazed when we meet other people, all the things they say and contribute. Well, geographically they're much closer, and there's more discussion and exchange of ideas. We in Cornwall are so far away, and we don't have any money. We need a substantial amount to help us create a better standard for the whole of Cornwall.
With me in the studio to discuss some of the points raised in that report is Mervyn Davey, Deputy Principal Officer of the Cornwall County Council's Social Services Department, who's in charge of the services for the hearing impaired in Cornwall. And since Mervyn will be using his first language, English, we're joined by interpreter Alan Haythornthwaite. Now, there are two main issues that come from the film. One is about privacy. There doesn't seem to be any. And confidentiality. That seems to be a problem. Is the situation still the same?
Things in Cornwall have certainly improved quite a lot over the past 18 months. Certainly now we no longer use social workers as interpreters unless the deaf person expressly wishes this. On the issue of confidentiality, this is very, very important. And certainly, there's no way now that an interpreter will pass information over to a social worker or vice versa.
Now, you said there have been improvements over the last 18 months. Well, can you tell me what you mean? Because that certainly didn't come across in the film.
18 months ago, the deaf people in Cornwall, the deaf community, met with the Director of Social Services and expressed views similar to what I'm expressed on the videos today. His response was to ask me to have a development project, a pilot scheme, to see how an interpretation service could be developed in Cornwall. The way we did this was partly to actually pay for freelance workers and partly to help with their training. We've gone from a point of having no freelance workers at all to now where we have 4 or 5 people who are able to act in a freelance capacity with a mixed range of qualifications going from stage 3 down to stage 2, and some people who are native speakers. We also, by luck, have had a qualified interpreter in Cornwall for a time, which has helped. But we found deaf people weren't so interested in using this interpreter. They preferred to use their own people that they knew themselves.
Now, it seems to me that there's been a bit of a communication breakdown, because in the film there's no mention about having interpreters or interpreting services, but now you're saying you do have them. Is there a communication breakdown?
I don't believe there can be a communication breakdown because, as part and parcel of this scheme, deaf people themselves were training the interpreters they were using. They had an advisory group which has met either on a 6-monthly basis or as required. That group has advised me on the service they wanted and the people they would actually approve to act as communicators.
Now, you've said that there are services, but in the film it was said that there was no funding. Now, surely there's a contradiction there somewhere. How do you explain that?
I think with the funding issue, I differ quite strongly with the people on the video. There has been funding up until now, but the problem is I think it needs to be a policy. Funding is not a major issue, but policy is. And without a policy, we've got no future, both in terms of the health service and in terms of social services.
What do you mean by the county council needs a policy?
The problem at the moment is social workers are by and large doing everything. And it's not a social services issue by its alone. It's a health issue, it's a central government issue. And without a policy across the whole range of services, you'll never get anywhere. You'll struggle because it'll also be a very patchy affair.
Right, what's the situation now? What policy decisions have been taken so far?
Up until now, it's mostly been a question of liaising with deaf people and passing information on around. But I do think that now is the time for deaf people to present exactly what they do want and to quantify it with how many hours interpreting they need per week and so on. In a rural area like Cornwall, there's a fairly small number of deaf people, and they really will need to quantify their needs very carefully in order to be able to make a reasonable request for a service.
What's your view about central government's role in all this?
I think that central government will be crucial. I think if policy is made at that level, it'll help us all tremendously.
Thank you very much, Mervyn Davey. Staying with interpreting services, one part of Britain that is probably a bit better off than Cornwall is Scotland. But as Christopher Jones found out when he met a visitor from Norway recently, compared with some other countries, any part of the UK seems like a poor relation.
I want to compare the service between Scotland and Norway. Both countries have the same number of people, 5 million. Now, Norway has a voucher system, 20 vouchers per year. But a deaf person who, say, visits the doctor with an interpreter doesn't use a voucher. The service is paid for by the health department. If a deaf person goes for some sort of education or for training, an interpreter is provided and paid for by the education department. In employment, if one has to attend a meeting, the interpreter is paid for by the employment department. But interestingly, deaf professionals who need an interpreter are provided with one full-time. I was astounded, and it made me feel quite despondent, because in Scotland there's nothing like that. So the vouchers, what are they for? Well, say at your local flower society you want to hear the man giving a talk about pruning roses. That's what your voucher's for. Leisure interpreting. I was really taken aback. In Scotland there's absolutely nothing like that.
So is that just a case of hearsay? Or are things really that much better over there? Here with a weather report on the interpreting situation on the other side of the North Sea is Rachel.
It's often said that if you've got to depend on social services for anything, then Scandinavia is one of the best parts of the world to live in. And deaf sign language users share in the benefits enjoyed by the rest of the populations in the Scandinavian countries of Norway, Sweden and Denmark. Norway has a population of just 4 million, with 3,000 to 4,000 deaf signers. To cater for them, there are 96 registered interpreters, nearly as many as in the whole of the UK. So it's no wonder the services are better, as Christopher Jones described. Sweden's population is less than 8.5 million, with 10,000 deaf people. But it has about 300 interpreters. Interpreting is free of charge to deaf people and covers not only education, health and job training, but also major life events such as getting married and buying a car. In Denmark, there are 5 million people, about 4,000 deaf people, and 100 registered interpreters. Again, deaf people's entitlement is much more generous than in Britain, including the right to an interpreter for your first educational course after school, which can be anything up to 7 years. So the overall statistics provide sunny reading for Scandinavians, but gloomy figures for us here in Britain. Total population of the 3 Scandinavian countries, 17.5 million. Total number of deaf people, 17 to 18,000. Registered interpreters, nearly 500. That's 5 times more than the United Kingdom, which has a population of over 56 million, 50,000 plus deaf sign language users, but only 101 registered interpreters. So for each Scandinavian deaf person, there are about 15 times more interpreter hours available than in Britain.
Joining us now is Liz Scott-Gibson, Director of Sign Language Services at the British Deaf Association, and a founder member of EFSLI, the European Forum of Sign Language Interpreters.
Hi.
Now, in Scandinavia, they seem to have 15 times more interpreting hours than we have in Britain. Do you think we're very far behind other European countries?
If I were to look back, say, around 10 years, Britain was in a terrible state. But we are beginning to catch up. We're not doing too badly. We have established interpreter training, so we're getting there. We're pretty similar to the situation in France, Germany and Holland. People in Portugal, Spain and Greece now are much more badly off, and they need support. But to compare us with Scandinavia, we're not there yet. I've been told that in Finland, they have 750 registered interpreters for a tiny population of, I think, about 5 million. There are so many interpreters compared to us. We've a long way to go.
Can you tell me why Scandinavia has such a good service? And how can we achieve anything comparable?
It is a little bit different. Especially in Sweden and Denmark, their governments have recognised their sign languages. Governments have funded university research into sign language. Their governments have funded interpreter training. In Britain, do we have that kind of recognition? Not yet. But how did they achieve that recognition? It was deaf people getting together and lobbying. But it wasn't just deaf people. It was deaf people, hard of hearing people, parents, all getting together in a very powerful lobby, demanding and achieving this, working together. That was what was vital.
Do you think that we in Britain are ready yet to bring all these people together? The deaf community, the hard of hearing, the parents' organisations, and is that the way for us to achieve a good service?
Yes, I'd like to think we can. We've made a little bit of a start. The panel of 4 recently set up a commission of inquiry. We've received a little funding from the government to set up this commission. Who's in it? Deaf people, hard of hearing, deaf-blind, plus parents, interpreters, researchers. And we're now asking deaf people for their views, collecting information, and conducting a series of investigations into why services are poor. We're asking questions we want to know. We're getting a very good, positive response. And we intend to put forward a series of proposals and recommendations, hopefully to be published in July. This, we hope, will show a positive way forward. But when this is ready, is that the end of the story? It's only the very start. We then have to get behind it and push it forward to achieve something.
That is important because in my experience, any of the panel of 4's ideas or recommendations simply haven't come to anything. Now you're saying that we need to have some kind of push. How are we going to do that?
I think it's important that deaf people need not just to sit back and wait for things to be handed to them. The time is right now that deaf people should be saying they're not satisfied. They should be complaining. And if they don't know something, to ask. If they're unsure, to take it up through the deaf organisations, like the BDA, for example. To actually take action and move. It's only then we're going to achieve something. We can't just sit back and wait for it to happen. We have to roll up our sleeves and get moving. Time is now.
Thank you, Liz. Now, before we finish, earlier we were talking about the apparently superior services for deaf people in Scandinavian countries. But before we get too carried away and think that everything in the garden is rosy over there, just take a look at some recent footage of a demonstration in Denmark. Well, it may be hard to believe after what we said earlier, but in fact that was a demonstration held last September demanding deaf people's right to interpretation as a reminder to politicians of the seriousness of the situation. Liz, what does that tell us? Because in Denmark they seem to have everything, and yet there are still problems. Is it just a bottomless pit?
I think that Danish deaf people have had a taste of what they can achieve with interpreter provision, access education, jobs. It's amazing, but are they satisfied? They want more. They want equal opportunities. So I hope that British deaf people will learn from this. I hope that British deaf people will never be satisfied, want and demand more and better standards.
Thank you very much. Well, if the Danes, with their much better services, can mount a demonstration like that, well, maybe we could take a leaf out of their book. That's all for today. But if you would like more information about our programmes and more ideas to think about, why not send for our free booklet? You can see the address to write to at the end of the programme. Next week, we look at images of deaf people in film and television drama. We interview deaf actor Tony Newton. And we visit Liverpool's most famous close, Brookside. See you next week.
Here in Scotland and England, there's absolutely nothing. It's about time we deaf got together with interpreters and fought for our rights.